Well, we've now arrived at today's high point, and a great pleasure and honour of introducing Godela Weiss-Sussex and her book. Now, Godela, as we learned earlier today, has also just been promoted to reader, as if that were ever needed. And it's a more extensive reading that was hard to imagine. And to my mind, there's been a lot of talk in Britain about Heathrow as an international hub. Well, I feel that Godela has done a tremendous job towards turning the IMLR into an international cultural hub, international and national. I've mentioned, firstly, many remarkable range of edited volumes which Godela has edited and contributed to. In city literature, for example, or German Jewish writers, department stores to look at, and racehorses of genius, and many, many more, too many to mention. Godela has also supported a great range of comparative research and networking beyond the field of German studies on topics such as biological thinking or minority writing. Godela has also made a huge contribution to two-way and multi-path cultural exchange, which today in the UK is of ever-increasing importance to introducing how Shakespeare has been received in Europe, and then bringing encounters with European writers, especially German writers, of course, here to the UK. The series that she was involved in, the marvellous encounters, is my favourite, I think, of all your activities. This is writers and translators in conversation, and this has now been taken up by the Italianists as well. And all this kind of work is going to be ever more necessary if England is to remain bearable as a place to live in. Also remarkable is the degree of outreach in and beyond London through this country and also across to Europe. Starting London, for example, with the British Museum, and then all sorts of projects going on in other universities in this country and in Europe. And again, I would mention the Encounters programme, which came up to Nottingham, for example.
They've been involved from the start.
Now, today, many of us were at a conference, and this has been another great contribution that Godela makes to our friendship as researchers across different institutions. I would really emphasize this, the amount of work and brilliant, innovating effort you've put into bringing colleagues together and encouraging intellectual debate and friendship is absolutely terrific, just marvellous, Roger. Now, today, it is especially your book, Jüdin und Moderne, that we are here to hear about. And this offers very subtle, close readings of now a lot of fairly forgotten German Jewish women writers, who I hope are going to become more known now in the wake of your study. And along with these readings of the texts is also an archaeological excavation of the highly complex discursive field that these women inhabited. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say further on Jüdin und Moderne. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I don't know what to say. It's wonderful. So yes, I thought I'd talk to you about my book because it's taken me a rather long while to write it. And I feel I owe you a little report on what I've been doing so long. And so I thought I'd tell you a few things that I found interesting and also give you some indication of where I might go from here. So at the origin of the book was a certain frustration with the continuing emphasis in German Jewish studies on the work of canonical male authors, certainly in the period of the pre-First World War years. Now, over the last 20 years or so, as I was saying earlier, there have been important studies that have helped to redress the balance, but Godela Weiss-Sussex, still in 2008, identified the study of the construction of femininity in German Jewish literature as one of the key areas of further research. And it is this construction of femininity that is at the center of my study. But it is not the representation of Jewish women by male and or non-Jewish authors that I was interested in. We heard from Florian and of course also from Anna Ludewig, who are working in this field. But so it's not the Jewish woman as other, but the literary self-image and the question how Jewish women themselves reflect and reflect upon their experience of being ascribed a double or even triple minority status. This question seemed to me all the more urgent as Anne Fuchs had shown in her study on dislocation and abjection in modern German Jewish literature, that male German Jewish writers who didn't identify with the difference attributed to them transferred this difference into the paradigm of gender, thus, and I quote Anne here, turning woman into the site of abjection. The question how female writers dealt with this attribution of otherness logically and I think necessarily has to follow on from this observation. So I concentrated my study on the city of Berlin and on the period between 1900 and 1918. It's a period of immense change and plurality of movements in Berlin. And it can in many ways be seen as a concentration of social and political developments, not only state power but also in terms of reform movements. As a hub of German Jewish intellectual and artistic activity and a barometer of German Jewish relations. In those early 1900s, the project of assimilation was continued. Most German Jews, especially from the highly educated middle classes, regarded themselves as Germans first and foremost, and at the same time, however, anti-Semitic discourses gathered momentum too. So it is not surprising then that for many German Jewish writers, it was important to suppress the Jewish component of their identity, which implied difference or otherness. But it is the few who explicitly took a stand and discussed their complex hyphenated identity, those whose primary interest was not in the literary aesthetics, but in the active participation in societal discourses. It's those that I focused on. So they are, you might say, writers of second rank in aesthetic terms, perhaps, but they are writers of enormous energy and presence and intellectual acuity that made them grapple with die großen Fragen unserer Zeit, with the big questions of our time, as a critic remarked on Meisel Hess. And I think from these pictures you can have a little bit of a sense of how how much of a presence they were. I'm cheating with the Elisabeth Landau picture. I couldn't find a picture of her, so this is not her. I have considered all of their works as far as that was possible, because I felt that was necessary in order to understand and to place individual novels or pieces of writing. And also, I felt it was important to gain a feeling of their development and their sense of their personalities. But at the heart of the book is the paradigmatic analysis of 4 texts. And paradigmatic, I think they are, because these texts and their authors are as different from one another as is possibly imaginable. And in that sense, they may indicate the range of possibilities of German Jewish women's literature engagée in the period concerned. So, I looked at one discursive text, Else Lasker-Schüler's treatise Die moderne Jüdin of 1913, which discusses the contrastive images of modern and mythical traditional concepts of German Jewish femininity, and in that sense really gives a summary of all the discourses that were around at the time. And apart from this discursive text, I looked at 4 novels, but one of them is a Doppelroman, so 3 novels, all of which are firmly rooted in autobiographical experience. Auguste Hauschner's Doppelroman Die Familie Lovositz, which is the story of a German Jewish pair of siblings growing up in Prague. Prague again, we talked about Prague during the afternoon. But of particular importance for me is the narrative strand that is concerned with Camilla Lovositz, with the girl and her experience of a loveless childhood and an arranged marriage. I looked at Grete Meisel-Hess's novel Die Intellektuellen, published in 1911, a novel propagating a biologistic new ethic, with a young heroine, Olga, who very self-confidently promotes socialist, radical feminist and eugenic reform. And Elisabeth Landau's Der Holzweg, published under the pseudonym Outnard. She turned her name around. There's a story behind that as well. Elisabeth Landau's Der Holzweg, which, written in 1918, condemns the striving for a German-Jewish symbiosis as futile, as Holzweg, a dead end, and discusses the options for the way ahead. The leading voice in this novel is that of the protagonist Elise, who makes the case for immigration into another European country, so into England in this case. So we see radically different concerns and structures here, but even though it may not seem so at first sight, there's also some very interesting common ground. And in the following, I'll just pick up a few points and share some of the observations. So these are this is the structure of what I'm going to talk about: constructions of Jewishness in these works, the transfer of negative projections of difference, the Jewish woman as leader, always connected with ideas of motherhood and motherliness, literary strategies employed by these writers. Then I'll talk just briefly about what I'm aiming to do next, and come back to some concluding remarks on the historiography of German Jewish women's writing, which is going to be a toned-down copy of Robert's wonderful rant from earlier. I'll just go back briefly to the overview to help you keep your bearings, because I'm going to speak about novels that I assume most of you will not have read. Starting with the constructions of Jewishness, as I was saying earlier, these authors' thinking about Jewishness is in all cases a confrontation with an aspect of their own identity, either ascribed or accepted in their own choosing, that is seen as other by the German hegemonic culture. But beyond an indication of difference, I wanted to know, what does Jewishness mean to them, and how do they talk about it? Interestingly, they work with very divergent concepts. But in order to really understand what's going on, I think it's worth distinguishing Jewishness as a mental or psychological identitarian concept from the thinking about the Jewish body. So let's look at the identitarian concept first. In Kroner's ethnographic treatise, the Jewess appears both as negative image, the ever-hurried, superficial, ostentatious socialite, and as ideal. However, what seems at first glance to be a clear binary contrast between the pathologized modernity on the one hand and an incantation of a mythical oriental beauty or an idealized mother figure on the other, soon unravels into a rather confused entanglement of philo and anti-Semitic statements and rhetoric of assimilation and dissimilation. If one thing becomes clear, it's Kroner's ambivalence and inner conflict in view of the various contemporary discourses on Jewish femininity. In comparison, the three fictional texts present far more coherent perspectives. Hauschner describes Jewish femininity as a psychological burden that results from Jewish cultural history and from the patriarchal structures of Jewish society. The question that Hauschner puts at the center of Camilla's story is whether it is possible to break free from this burden, which over centuries has consolidated into a character trait, a tendency to melancholy or even depression. Complete turnaround for Meisel Hess, Jewishness is a mental strength, an emotional and intellectual energy. Working with contemporary discourses of Jewish intelligence, the topos of the smart Jew, enables her to construct the ascribed otherness as a positive feature on the basis of which she can present her Jewish protagonists as leaders for political and social reform. And Elisabeth Landau finally defines Jewishness as an ethical position, as the conscious decision to accept commonality with a people that is denigrated and excluded by the Aryan German majority, and to derive a defiant pride from this exclusion. Earlier we mentioned the pariah as described by Hannah Arendt, and it's exactly that position here. And in this context, Landau pointedly rejects Jewish self-abasement and assimilatory over-eagerness. And it's really important, I think, to keep in mind, this is 1918, so it's a very, very different climate than the other three texts that I'm discussing. So the range of concepts of Jewishness presented here as psychological, intellectual, ethical notion is clearly very broad across the four texts. But all of them unanimously reflect the rejection of the Jewish body, or more precisely, of the features that contemporary discourse coded as Semitic or Jewish corporeality. Even in Meisel Hess and Landau's texts, whose protagonists show certain pride in their Jewishness, the ideal of the Nordic race clearly dominates. What is interesting, however, is how, according to their different worldviews and aims, the authors frame and discuss this perceived taint of the Jewish body in very different ways. For Hauschner, one of whose main characters describes himself as schwarzer Fleck, a black stain, the Jewish body is the physical manifestation of the psychological burden of Jewishness. Meisel Hess, in contrast, sees the stereotypical markers of Jewishness as genetic characteristics that can be overcome in the process of evolution. With thinkers like Ernst Haeckel, the German Darwin, as he was called, she trusts in biological assimilation as a process of perfection over generations, a process in which traits perceived as ugly can be progressively excluded through responsible reproduction. So this kind of biologistic argument, which is linked to ideas of improving the human race, may worry us in hindsight, and probably they should, especially as Meisel Hess' Jewish protagonists are cast as Übergangsgeschöpfe, so as creatures of transition who have to make sacrifices in the name of evolution, both Jewish protagonists refrain from parenthood. But it is hugely important, I think, not to be blinded by our perspective of hindsight, because what this kind of biologistic thinking does, it opens up great potential for emancipation and integration. What Meisel-Hess presents in her novel is an inclusive and optimistic model of the future, and precisely one in which, through the selection of the best characteristics of all white races, and Jewish intellectuality was presented as one of these characteristics that were to be inherited, racial differences between the Aryans and the Semites are overcome. Landau uses the descriptions of the Jewish body to underline the ethical stance of her protagonists. One of her central male characters, Karl Hinrichsen, is contrasted with those over-assimilated Jews who have been bent and crippled by the anti-Semitic oppression to which they have been subjected. Hinrichsen, by contrast, stands tall, literally. His description as a tall, blonde Hühner corresponds entirely to the contemporary imaginary of the so-called Nordic race. So on the one hand, his physique reveals the lack of substance of attributions of difference, but on the other, it again confirms the all-pervasive idealization of the Nordic features and the rejection of Semitic markers that went with it. Kroner is the only one of my writers who shows at least an attempt to counter the contemporary understanding of a hierarchy of races. She references the imagination of the Jewess as mystical, beautiful, oriental. So she alludes to this trope of the beautiful Jewess, which is so ubiquitous in male writers' texts. However, this image, which might indeed have functioned as a positive principle, is almost entirely obliterated and smothered by negative stereotyping of the worst kind. She repeats and clearly buys into the cliché of the hypersexualized Jewish woman, freely adapted from Otto Weininger's infamous treatise Geschlecht und Charakter of 1903. This may be a good moment to return to Anne Fuchs's observation that male German Jewish writers translate their own experience of objection into the literary representation of femininity. So is there an equivalent in female authors' work? Do they also transfer a negative projection onto a group of however constituted others? Well, in the three novels I looked at, this is indeed the case. The experience of objection is here translated into the paradigm of class. In all three cases, it is the Jewish petty bourgeoisie that is decried as an intellectually and emotionally stifling and an uncultured environment. The liberation from this milieu is in all texts emphatically described as a necessary precondition for the development and fulfillment of the cultured Jewish woman. And this development and fulfillment, or the trajectory towards it, is conceived everywhere as more than just the narrative of individual experience. These texts and the heroines are carriers of reform ideas, of models for social progress and a better future. Female experience becomes a claim for female leadership, a claim that is always, in all cases, linked to the ideas of cultural renewal associated in contemporary discourse with concepts of femininity, motherhood, and motherliness. But again, in a surprising variety of ways. Kroner is the odd one out here. She suggests a step back into a pre-modern era in which women aim to be mothers and mothers alone. So in an anti-modern turn, she suggests a step back into an idealized past as cultural salvation. Hauschner, Meisel-Hess and Landau, on the contrary, use the concepts of motherhood and motherliness to legitimize positions that oppose established norms and majority thinking in a progress-oriented and forward-looking way. Hauschner's Camilla finds a way to oppose patriarchal dogma through embracing motherhood, I'll return to this, Meisel-Hess's Olga propagates the ideas of the radical feminist League for the Protection of Mothers, the Bund für Mutterschutz, and fights for all women's right to motherhood, independent of their marital status, as a basis for social and biological progress. Landau finally makes very clear that the competence and leadership role attributed to her Elise rest on the experience and responsibility of this character as a mother. Elise's emigration to England with her young son is constructed as representing a specifically female life-giving and nurturing principle. So Landau paints a picture of Berlin as a city of death, and she uses really harrowing expressionist imagery to do this. It's a city that has been made uninhabitable by anti-Semitic hatred and is haunted by demented shadows. So the choice of Elise to emigrate is really equal to the choice of life with this given this background. The insistence of female difference and the model character of these writers' main protagonists are bounded to very different literary strategies and contexts. All authors were very savvy and took great care to lend their arguments weight through the choice of genre, publisher, and intertextual references, as these framed their narratives and steered the reading process. So Kroner ostensibly embeds her treatise on the modern Jewess in two contexts. Firstly, in the context of the Jewish Renaissance. This is what she explicitly states, but reading the text you realize that it's kind of window shopping. It's not actually the discourse that she buys into, but she clearly sees it as opportune to publish her text under the banner of Jewish Renaissance. And the second context that she uses is that of Völkerpsychologie, psychology of peoples, which was a kind of ethnography that was established in the late 19th century as a third way between science and between the sciences and the humanities, and really became the foundation of social sciences. So she does this in order to accord her text the status of objective and scientific observation, although actually she borrows far more from other lines of discourse, ranging from Reform Judaism to Otto Weininger. Meisel-Hess places die Intellektuellen in the tradition of the Weltanschauungsroman, a genre defined and promoted by Wilhelm Wölsche and monist philosophers such as Ernst Haeckel, which aim to propagate this new biologistic ethic. So the basic idea of this was that there is no separation between Körper and Geist, between body and spirit. And this being so, the morals or the moral rules of our times have to go with what is good for the body and not deny what the body as Wilhelmine morality did. So that's at the heart of this reform idea of the biologistic ethic. And she was very much at the heart of this reform movement. Indeed, she was quite a celebrity. There was a postcard printed with her in the center of a circle celebrating the first monist international meeting. For both Meisel-Hess and Kroner, the language of science promised a readership outside German Jewish circles. As David Bile put it, to be a scientist at the turn of the century meant that one at least theoretically belonged to a fraternity in which identity played no role. Hauschner and Landau, however, make use of the German Jewish novel genre par excellence, the Jewish Zeitroman, a genre not dissimilar to the English social novel in the tradition of Fielding or Thackeray. Both primarily address a Jewish audience, as they are aiming for change within the Jewish community, but they use this popular genre in order to transport new, unexpected content and, in a kind of revolution from inside, to to oppose dominant discourses within the Jewish majority. Hauschner to denounce the practice of arranged marriages, and Landau to question and ultimately condemn the continued pursuit of a German-Jewish symbiosis, even in the face of unprecedented levels of anti-Semitic agitation, 1918. It is especially with these two authors in mind that I'd like to claim the significance of the works of German Jewish women writers as minor literature, littérature mineure, in the sense used by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, as the literature of a minority that opposes the normative discourses of a majority. A literature that demonstrates possibilities of becoming and highlights the process that underlies the formation of a micropolitical awareness. I would like to argue that the status of Jewish women's writing in German as that of a minority within a minority allows a perspective that goes beyond binary distinctions between German and German-Jewish points of view, disrupts established ways of thinking, and offers suggestions for a different future. I'd like to illustrate this with one example from Hauschner's Familie Lovositz. Hauschner depicts Camilla's life as a twofold martyrdom, das doppelte Martyrium des Weibseins und des Judentums. This is a quote not from the novel, but from an essay that Hauschner wrote on Rahl Barnhag. In the first volume of the Doppelroman, Camilla, born into the well-to-do middle-class household of a German-Jewish family, is married off to a petit bourgeois husband without having a say in the matter. She gives birth to a child, but suffers a breakdown soon after, as she cannot reconcile herself to her new status of wife and mother. The second volume sees her in Berlin, where she's been sent to recover. Really silly idea, anyway. And after a lengthy and disappointing stay in the city, she finally resolves to accept her motherhood, but to separate with her baby girl from her husband. The novel's end has been read repeatedly as depicting Camilla's return into the marriage, into the family idyll, and to the side of her good-natured husband. The quotations are from Ludwig Geiger's assessment of the text in 1910 and from Hella Sabrina Langes of 2006. Indeed, this embracing of the status quo of male-female relationships is to be expected in a Hauschner novel. She wasn't exactly a feminist. But what she actually, rather surprisingly, describes is Camilla's self-liberation from the imposed marriage, an act of defiance linked to the bitter indictment of the patriarchal practices of the German Jewish minority in Prague. So why the misreadings? On the basis of expectation, perhaps, but also because at a crucial juncture in the text mimics the decision process. It becomes fragmentary, allowing only disjointed thoughts to emerge, and it complicates the clear confirmation of meaning. Let's look at this a little more closely. So Camilla has just traveled back to Prague to be with her daughter, who lives with her husband's family. She creeps into the house, unseen by all, and the reunion between mother and child, which explicitly excludes the father, is described in the following words. Sie kuschelte sich an ihr Kind, ihr war es, ihr, niemals wieder jemand zwischen ihnen. Fragmentary speech, broken up syntax, sketch out the dawning possibility of a life as single mother. The decision is clearly marked as a process, one that Camilla, who up to this point has been or has tried to be the obedient Jewish daughter and wife, cannot yet structure coherently and express authoritatively. But Hauschner leaves no doubt that for her this is the path to a healthy life, to liberation, as it means breaking free from the literal and metaphorical narrowness and darkness of the petit bourgeois household of Camilla's in-laws. And it means breaking what she describes as a generational chain of failure of the Lovesitz mothers towards their daughters. Whether this departure into the life of a single mother is actually realistic and possible is another question. And Hauschner is very, very guarded about that. I mean, she by no means advocates this as the right way, but she leaves us hanging saying, you know, this is ideally the right way, but whether it's possible is doubtful. Throughout the novel, Hauschner prepares Camilla's subversive act of self-liberation by referring to, but twisting, a prominent established German Jewish discursive tradition. Again and again, we find texts of the 19th and early 20th centuries explain certain negative modes of behavior that are stereotypically associated with Jewishness as caused by the history of persecution of the Jewish community. Ostentation, for instance, is explained by the long periods of want and destitution the Jewish people had to suffer. Loud and compulsive speaking by long periods of enforced silence, and chronic haste by life-threatening persecution. These topoi always pivot around the basic tenet of the suffering of the Jews as caused by the Christians. Hauschner, however, turns this trope on its head. Instead of confirming Jewish victimhood, she places the cause of Jewish suffering within Jewish culture itself, in the dogma of Judaism and in patriarchal family structures. Der sehnsüchtige Geist der Juden, for instance, so the tendency to melancholic yearning, is in Hauschner's hands not rooted in the experience of exclusion endured by generations of Jews, a trope that would be expected here, but in the Jewish practice of the arranged marriage. Wer weiß, Rudolf muses, ob seinen sehnsüchtigen Sinn nicht irgendeiner Frau verdammte, deren Sehnsucht an einen ungeliebten Mann verhandelt, hatte ungestillt verbrennen müssen. Particularly interesting here is that female experience is cast as a basis for Jewish consciousness or a Jewish mindset shared by both genders. With reference to the configuration of minor literatures, Tom Cheeseman has spoken of the burdens of representation. The phrase deliberately stands in the plural, as it refers to at least a twofold burden: the assumption that the writers speak for the whole of a minority group, and the expectation of this group that they be represented in a positive light. Hauschner does not allow these burdens to be imposed on her. She rejects them from her position as a minority writer within a minority because of her perspective as a German Jewish woman. And this is just one example. Similar strategies of overturning established topoi and of opening up potentials for liberation and for future becoming are to be found in other texts by female German Jewish authors. And all this provides much material for a new research project, which builds on the work presented here, but brings me right up into the 21st century, which I look forward to, and about which I look forward to telling you in the years ahead. But today, if you'll allow me, I'd like to end with a plea for careful reading, for reading without assumptions, agendas, or theories to prove. There's always a danger of doing this. We talked about this afternoon. For all of us, maybe we want a writer to be progressive, to be a feminist, to be a Nietzschean. And so we home in on the clues that support our ideas. But especially in an area that is as under-researched as that of German Jewish women writers, immense damage can be done, as a skewed or even just a partial and therefore distorting reading isn't likely to come under much scrutiny. So working on these little-known writers brought this home to me very forcefully, for most of these texts had been hardly taken notice of before. Even if very little had been said about them so far, I found that they had been misrepresented, and at times quite fundamentally so. Looking at Kroner's text, the identification of the author as Jewish had been at the heart of the research consensus. And following on from that, her text was interpreted as an act of self-positioning as a Jewish woman and of defending, rescuing the ideal of the self-confidently Jewish woman in times of assimilation. They're going with this idea of the Jewish Renaissance. However, what I found was a text dominated not by the identity, by Jewish identity, but by distance from that identity, the ethnographer's position, by ruptures, tensions, and contradictions that indicate the confusion and insecurity of a Jewish woman who was about to convert to Christianity. And indeed, we know that by 1925 she had converted. Hauschner, her novel is not a Bildungsroman focused on a young man, Rudolf Lovositz, whose Jewishness is all but incidental. This was Ludwig Geiger's view, and still to a certain extent was supported by Andreas Herzog in 2002. But it is a double-stranded psychological study of brother and sister, with the sister's story being in many ways more revealing than the brother's. And the Jewish culture in which they grow up is absolutely crucial to their development as characters. In fact, the grappling with their Jewishness is the central issue of this novel. And I just want to note here that Anglophone Auslandsgermanistik has always understood this. Florian knows this. Meisel-Hesse's main character, Olga, is not a personification of Nietzsche's Dionysian principle, as Hinton Thomas claims in his book on Nietzsche, but a case study of personal development according to monist philosophy. So it's not the sense of creative release and intoxication that are central to Olga's character, far from it. Meisel-Hesse argues for a restraint of all drives and excesses and for an adherence to the Darwinian principle of instinct, defined as a way of listening and adhering to the reasoning of nature, die Vernunft der Natur, reason of nature. And Landau, well, we have a different case here, a case of deliberate misreading and misrepresenting with a view to silencing the author. Two reviews appeared of Der Holzweg in 1918, so in the year of publication, and they were published in the two most influential periodicals read by assimilated German Jews at the time, Im Deutschen Reich and die Neue Jüdische Monatshefte. Both reviewers revealed Landau's female identity, which hadn't been visible, she just signed Audnal, and instrumentalized her female identity to discredit her as an author. They accused her of lack of political understanding and having outdated views on the Jewish question. A woman clearly couldn't understand the complex political facts. Of not being in control of her emotions, but writing from hurt, of anti-Semitic aggression, and of lack of creative originality. The argument here is particularly interesting. They can't deny that this is a good book. They can't deny it's well written. So they even say she writes like Fontane and Heinrich Mann, which in my book is a pretty good thing to do. But they turn this into an insult because they imply that her writing is epigonic. She's just copying the great. So she can't win. She writes badly, it's bad. She writes well, it's equally bad. So why do they do this? Remember, this is 1918. It's the time of a wave for anti-Semitism unequaled by anything Germany had seen before, as the Jews were blamed for the lost war. In the face of this, both reviewers, one of them, by the way, is Siegbert Feuchtwanger, so a cousin of Leon Feuchtwanger. Both reviewers and their journals continued to fight for the integration of the Jews into German society. So their strategy was to make people aware of the positive Jewish contribution to society and to argue for the benefits of coexistence, if not integration. Feuchtwanger had published 2 years earlier a book entitled Die Judenfrage als politisches und wissenschaftliches Problem, in which he basically argues that we just need to discuss this properly and then we will solve the Jewish question. It's something that can be solved, and look at all the positive things the Jews have done for Germany. Now Landau's novel, Der Holzweg, which declared the end of any dream of a German-Jewish symbiosis, and included graphic depictions of the undignified behavior of those buckling and converting under the anti-Semitic onslaught, this novel was the last thing they wanted to see. It provided, as they rightly claimed, ammunition to the enemy, to the anti-Semites. So you can see their point, politically, but as literary historians, we can only deplore the loss they inflicted. For the novel sank without a trace after these two reviews. It was the first of a trilogy, but neither the second nor the third volume were reviewed in any of the relevant publications. So, as I was saying, let's read and reread with care in an attempt to give a voice back to writers from and about whom we haven't quite heard enough.